Welcome to the Bible Made Easy with Stephen Craig. I mentioned in my first video that I'm making these videos for people who believe in God and people who believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. In my very first video, I introduced you to a teaching tool that I've been using for more than 40 years. It's my Old Testament timeline. And when we looked at that Old Testament timeline, we said that the Bible really changes focus in Genesis 12 with the call of Abraham, but that the first 11 chapters deal with the history of the world. Now, in my last video, I talked about that pre-flood world, and this is the events that we covered. We talked about the Garden of Eden, of course, how sin entered the world, how the world became corrupt, how God brought the flood to cleanse the earth of wickedness. We looked at the development of Noah's family and then the Tower of Babel. But I still had some thoughts about that pre-flood world that I wanted to share with you. I said when you think about the pre-flood world, you have to think that things were entirely different. In Genesis 1 verse 9, when God created the world, he said, "Let the dry land appear." So what I believe is that the earth back then was one landmass, and think of it as being a warm tropical place with a water canopy, because you remember that when the flood came, it says that God opened up the windows of heaven, so water came from above, and it said also he broke up the fountains of the great deep. I mentioned in one of the other videos that Dr. Grady McMurtry is a Christian with at least 2 PhDs, and he has a lot of good information about the creation, about early age of the earth, the flood, and some of these other subjects. So I would encourage you to look up Dr. Grady McMurtry and get a little more perspective on some of these things that I'll be mentioning. But if you think about that pre-flood world again as being this warm, tropical climate, and you had people living, what seems to us incredible ages, 7, 8, 900 years. You have, it says, giants upon the earth in those days. And of course, we know that dinosaurs would have lived then. But I think it's also interesting to note that the giants and dinosaurs continued to exist even after the flood. Because we know giants are mentioned throughout the scriptures. Really, they were pretty prominently mentioned up until the time of David, about 1000 BC. But after that time, giants aren't really mentioned biblically anymore. And we know that dinosaurs also existed after the flood, because in the book of Job, chapters 40 and 41, it mentions 2 creatures there, the behemoth and the leviathan, and the scriptures are clearly of dinosaurs. And God said, "Have you seen the behemoth which I made along with you?" Again, showing that man and dinosaurs did exist together. So you think about the pre-flood world, you think about the flood that happened, and then some changes that took place in the earth. We know that when after the flood that Noah and his descendants were all together. They were one language, and they came together to build the Tower of Babel. And I think that's interesting because if you had just came through a worldwide flood, I think it's pretty logical that you'd want to build a tower in case there was another flood, that you would be able to climb that tower to escape the waters of the flood. But we know that the Tower of Babel was something that God didn't like, because the people were trying to glorify themselves instead of glorify God. So that's when it said that God confused the languages and scattered the people. So that's how we got our different nationalities that we see now around the world. But I think there's some more interesting things that happen, because we read in Genesis 10 and verse 25, there was one of Noah's descendants, a man by the name of Peleg, and his name means division. It says, "For in his days the earth was divided." So I think that not only did God scatter the people into different nations, but also that he broke up the land, the original land that he had created, and to the different continents that we have today. It's a more accepted thing in science now. They call it the idea of Pangea, that they believe that all the continents of the earth were one at one time. And if you look at a map of the world, you can see how you can just take the continents of the world and put it together like a big puzzle. Of course, the difference is you have the evolutionists that say these things took place over millions and millions of years, where, of course, as Christians, we would look at this as something that God did in thousands of years, not in millions of years. But what would happen as the earth was divided and people were scattered? There's something else God had to do, and that was to change the climate. And I think that this would be the reason that dinosaurs, although they existed after the flood, that they did not continue to live. I think that the change of climate is an explanation for the ice age. I know in science they claim there were several ice ages. I believe there's just one. I believe that after the flood, God at some point did change the climate, and that caused the waters of the flood to freeze and to recede into what we have now as our polar ice caps. And I think that's a reasonable and logical thing to think about from a Christian perspective. And it also explains the ages of man, because you see in that pre-flood world, in that warm, moist, tropical climate, that's when people were living to be hundreds of years old. But it's interesting that after the flood, you start seeing the ages of men decline to what we now think is normal. For example, Noah, he was 600 at the time of the flood, and it said he lived another 350 years. So he was 950 years old when he died. One of his descendants, Shem, was 500. Eber lived to be 430 years. Terah, the father of Abraham, lived to be 205. Abraham was 175. Isaac was 180. Jacob lived to be 147. Joseph 110. So after the flood, I believe there was this climate change that then you see the age of men declining to what we consider now to be more normal. And you say, well, where is the evidence of this? As I mentioned when I did the last video, that these early chapters of the Bible are some of the most controversial, because there are such a variety of opinions, and it's not really something we can prove, so we can't be dogmatic whatever opinion we hold. But I think that it's logical, because I think we can do see evidence that pre-flood world, that it existed and that it was extremely different. I think it's interesting that in every culture around the world, they all have legends of the flood and beliefs about a global flood. Also, I think it's very interesting, the legend of Atlantis, because what you had there, you had this advanced society that perished in the sea. So rather than thinking in terms of an island in the middle of the Atlantic, I think Atlantis was a description of the pre-flood world. It was that world before the flood. And where's the evidence? Well, you look around the world, you can go from South America to Europe, again to Asia, all around the world, even in islands in the Philippines, South Pacific. You see ruins that shows that one time there was a highly advanced civilization, and they were all around the world. You see things in common. They all had legends of giants. They all had pyramids. That, you think it's coincidental that they were building pyramids in South America and pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in the Far East? No, I think that shows that the people were all part of the same pre-flood world, and then after the flood, you had, of course, different societies around the world. Now, in our next video, we're going to get off all the speculation, get down to a little more biblical fact. But we'll begin our next video. We'll pick up in Genesis chapter 12 with the call of Abraham, and begin to see how the family of Abraham did grow into the nation of Israel. Hope this video has been interesting, and hope that you'll join me again. Have a good day.